Well, hello, Chicago.
No place like home, right?
Yeah, there's no place like home. Well, thank you, Allison, for that great introduction. And we really are glad to be home. And we are also really excited. So you all are in for a treat because this is the book event that has not only Valerie Jarrett, but also has Laura Jarrett. So we are thrilled. We've got Laura for the first part of our conversation, and then me and Valerie. And I have to say that, and I'll try to say this without getting overly emotional, but this is a wonderful book, my friend. It really is.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book. For those of you who haven't read it yet, you are in for a treat of really a journey and find your voice and messages for women of all ages. It's not just young women. I know that was a big part of your audience, but it really touches all women. And I want to start because you have an amazing family, you two, an amazing family history. And there's a part in the book where you visually, we can all imagine it, because you're in that part where you're looking at the portraits of your family that goes all the way back, and these generations of amazing people and the expectations that you felt. And I want to ask first Valerie, what was it like to be part of that incredible family? And then for Laura, what was your experience being part of that incredible family?
Well, so first of all, good evening, everybody. Laura and I are so happy to be back home. There is no place like home, and to be a block from where I grew up with my cousins who are here tonight, it feels wonderful. And so, as Tina mentioned, my grandmother and my Aunt Larnita in their home had incredible photographs of our family history. And sometimes when we weren't playing and torturing one another as kids, I would pause and I would look at these portraits and try to figure out what life must have been like for them. And one of my ancestors that always struck me as the one that whenever I was nervous about doing something, I would think about him, and that's my great-grandfather named Robert Robinson Taylor. And he was the son of a man who was born a slave in Wilmington, North Carolina. And when his father was freed, he started earning money as a carpenter and saved enough money to send his son to MIT. And so he was the first African American to graduate from MIT in 1892. And I used to try to imagine what must that, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool, thank you. I would try to imagine, what was that like getting on that train, and what did his father think, having come from such humble beginnings, to see the progress in that arc. And then I thought about, what was it like for the white students at MIT who probably had never had a black colleague before? And were they kind to him? Did he feel isolated? What was going on in his mind? And so whenever I was ever scared, I would start to think about him. Or another great-great-grandfather who was in the Louisiana legislature and gave a speech on the floor imploring his colleagues to integrate the rail system. And he said, in very personal terms, so it's okay for a black maid or housekeeper or babysitter to ride along in the train car with your children, but I, as your colleague in the legislature, can't do that. Well, he was unsuccessful in making that argument, but I just thought about what courage that took. And so in a way, it made me feel like anything was possible, and I had nothing to complain about. And in another way, it made me feel like, oh my goodness, how could I possibly ever live up to those expectations? So, Laura, how did it make you feel? You looked at those same photographs.
So, like my mother, I am also an only child, but I never felt lonely. And I think that is in large part due to our family, which is out in full force, as usual, here tonight. And we are known to have big family dinners on Sundays, which my grandmother still convenes, even at 90. She somehow still insists upon doing the cooking, even when some of us wish we could chip in.
There's some tag-alongs like me who aren't really in the family, but we show up.
Everyone's welcome, right? That's exactly right. It was sort of an open door policy. Whoever kind of glommed on that day gets to come. And I think as an only child, it's such a great feeling to always know that you have backup. And so I was lucky not only to have an amazing mother, but also to have grandparents that lived so close by. So when she had to work late at night, I always had somewhere to go. And I also had a sitter that was with me, Alma Brown, who she writes about extensively in the book and really leans on as a source of support. And she talks about how she was able to breathe and go to work because she knew Mrs. Brown was going to be there, and she worried about what would happen if Mrs. Brown didn't show up on time, but she was always there like clockwork. And so I was lucky to kind of have that foundation of support of family and extended family from day one, and even family from all of her buddies at the city, also some of who are here, Kathy Branch and Susan Carlin. I would go to work with her on the weekends and sort of play office and run around City Hall, knowing that everyone was welcoming and there was no shame in bringing your kids to work because you had to work on a Saturday.
So while we have you both, I want to talk about your parents, Valerie, because you have two really special parents, and Laura, I especially want to hear about your relationship, with your grandparents and especially with your grandfather, because for those of us who knew him, he was incredibly special. But to have him as a role model and a dad, the way you write about him in the book, and going to Paris, that wonderful Paris trip, but then your relationship, Laura, with him and how he was there, the guy picking you up going early to pick you up from school every day.
Every single day. Even once I had a driver's license, he still picked me up and took me to school every day.
And he did get there an hour early, and so he kind of made my mother and I not look so good, because when we did pick her up, on the rare occasions, we'd come coasting in at the last minute.
in the back.
And when you come in at the last minute, you're like a block and a half away. And my father said to us, as he chastised us for not being there an hour early, he said, when she comes out of the school, I want to be the first person she sees. I never want her to wonder whether or not I'm going to be there. And my mother and I were like, well, she knows where we'll be. We'll be down the block a little way. So,
but part of it is he clearly felt a sense of responsibility, right? Knowing that my mom was a single mom, he felt like he needed to step up. And I'm not sure that all fathers would be able to do that. We were lucky enough that he was at a time in his career where he had retired, and so I sort of got the benefit of having him at that stage in life and got to have a really special relationship with him, going to school every day and having that special time where it was just the two of us. And I ended up writing my college essay about those rides back and forth and some of the lessons that he imparted to me. And sometimes it was the things that were unsaid that were probably the best, and he sort of knew like when to push and when to kind of shut up, and when was a good time to lean in with like a lesson, and when to back up a little bit in a way that my mom and my grandmother would just sort of beat you over the head with it. He sort of had a delicate approach, but we were just so lucky to have someone who was such a rock and who you could rely on. There was nothing he wouldn't do for you, and there was always just complete unconditional love.
And that's true for both of them. I mean, my mother's not here because at age 90, she's still at work. And she made it perfectly clear she had a class to teach. And so she'd catch me tomorrow when I do some events tomorrow. But my parents are, I'm telling you, that's my mom. But they complemented each other. And I think that what they did for the both of us, and which I think they try to do for the rest of our family, is unconditional love coupled with very high expectations and a safety net when you stumble and fall. And they encouraged us to take risks. And they said, look, go out there and find your passion and figure out what it is you want to do with your life. And if you stumble, we'll be here for you. And that allowed me to breathe. It allowed me to leave a job I did not like at this, working for a big corporate law firm, making plenty of money and having a great office and a pretty fancy life by anybody else's measure, but one that made me miserable. I'm sorry if I've offended any of the corporate lawyers
we
who
have
are
this
here
conversation
tonight.
all the time. I stayed in the law, right?
She loved it. She loved the law.
I did not.
And Laura tried it, and then she did not. But it's hard when you have like a plan and you're sticking to your plan, and it is, in my case, it was kind of the path of least resistance, because in law school they make it so easy to go to a big firm. And I did kind of all the things that were easy. I married the boy next door. That was easy. That didn't work out either. And so here I am with that not working out and the law firm's not working out. And I took this leap of faith because a good friend of mine said, why don't you think about doing something more important than just focusing on yourself, something that gives back to the city that you love so much. And Elvin Charity had been working at the city for Harold Washington. Harold Washington had just been reelected, and he encouraged me to go to the city. And my parents thought it was a crazy idea, and in fact, my mom took me to work the first day and said, I can't believe I paid all that tuition for you to go do this with your life. And I remember I walked into my office, this little cubicle with a window facing the alley, and I felt like I was where I belonged. And I knew, even though my parents thought the decision was kind of a nutty one, that they would support me, both financially and emotionally, to take this chance.
Well, but Laura, you kind of did the same thing. Speaking of someone, like I was in one job for 23 years, the next job for all 8 years of the Obama administration, then I went back to the law, right? I'm like not the courageous swerve my career person, but you did the same thing. I remember we had like a lunch when you were thinking about it, and I'm the person like, stay at the law firm.
Make partner.
Like, not the advice she took. So talk to us, though, about your change, because it was a big switch. You left the law, and now you're on national TV, breaking news from the DOJ all the time.
And it's funny because reading my mom's book, it's eerie how similar I felt. She describes in the opening pages, sitting in her fancy office in Willis Tower, and she's looking out the window and she's sort of contemplating her life, and she's crying because she's miserable and she's thinking, this can't be all that there is. This can't be my life. And I remember having so many similar feelings, being at the law firm, feeling like, is this all there is? Like, there's gotta be more than this. And it's so amazing to have gone through that exact same thing, even though having grown up with her telling me all along, you can do whatever you want. You don't need to feel boxed into one particular career path. Take chances. She was always encouraging me to try to think as broadly as possible, and I was obviously given all the opportunities in the world, and yet I still felt like I had to have that plan, and I needed to stick with the plan. And so I think hopefully the book will resonate with people who just need a little push, and they just need to have somebody to give them permission. And thankfully, she's always had my back and always given me permission to take chances. And finally, just being miserable is such a great motivator. You get to the point where you just can't take it anymore. And so I decided, I was at a point where my husband and I didn't have a kid yet, and we had no more student loans, and we thought, okay, this is our chance. If we don't take it now, we're never gonna have the courage to do it. If we have the golden handcuffs forever, we're not gonna wanna make the move. And so I decided to leave the law firm and jump into cable news in September of 2016, before a very important election.
And her beat, by the way, is the Justice Department.
She thought she was going to be covering a little different Justice Department than the one, but this has been a real challenge and an exciting opportunity for you, right?
Yeah, and if I hadn't taken that chance then, I don't think I would have ever had the courage to do it. I think you have to try to jump at a moment where you have a little bit of that safety net, but I think if I had waited, I would have always regretted it.
So I have two last questions before we lose Laura. One is, tell us here in Chicago what it is like to be in D.C. these days, reporting from the DOJ on CNN.
It's not boring.
Like.
A day in the life.
Part of the reason I took the job and I took the jump, Tina, was honestly because I got to a point at the law firm where I wasn't learning anything anymore. And I thought, this can't be at 30, where I feel like I know exactly how every single day is gonna go for the rest of my entire life here. I can just see it, and it's boring. And I didn't quite know how exciting what I was signing up for was gonna be. I couldn't possibly have predicted that I would be covering such a consequential investigation of my generation. But I'm sure glad that I took that risk and that I took that jump. And I'm sure glad that I chose cable, because there's so much time all day long. They actually need to put you on TV. And so they're willing to take a chance on somebody because they need to fill the chance. And so I am in the hot seat literally chained to my booth at the Justice Department because at any moment, someone could get fired, someone could get indicted, something really bad could happen, and I get to be there for it.
And she's breaking the news. For those of you who aren't watching, Laura Jarrett is breaking news from DOJ. And so my last question, so as you know, your mom and I share the fact that we were single working moms. I remember you at like little age 2 and 3, we were watching Bulls games, with Patrick and you. But as working moms, we worried all that time, right? We worried, what were we doing? How are we going to turn out? There's probably young parents out there who had the same thing. But so now here you are. Now you can actually tell us, right? What was it like to have the working mom that you did, and how did that influence your life and where you are now?
Well, part of what I didn't appreciate, I think, and with the book, I think really tries to explore, is how much guilt she was carrying around about having to work. I had no appreciation for the fact that she felt this burden about going to work every day, because that was all I grew up with, that was all I knew. I thought that was perfectly normal, and I never expected her to be at home waiting for me with cookies when I got home. I expected for me to kind of just take care of myself, and I would see her later. Maybe we would have takeout and watch Seinfeld, and that would be the end of the night. But the book really shows how so many working moms are carrying around all of this guilt. And I just hope that after reading it, someone, and maybe there are people in the audience who can just let that go. Your kids don't care. Your kids have their own lives. No one's worried about the fact that you're working. Go to work. Or not, if you don't want to. But I just hope that there are, again, I hope that the book gives women permission to just do what they want to do. And going to work gave her so much pleasure, and you can tell she gets so much joy out of serving her community and joining the Washington administration. And if she had stayed at that law firm, she would have been miserable. And if she had stayed with me at home, she would have been miserable. And so I'm glad that she found her own path and that she found her own life.
And tell us, is that an example, as people can tell, Laura is about to become a mom?
As you can tell, it's obvious.
We're all very excited about this. And is that a lesson you're thinking about as you get ready to become a mom?
Yeah, I don't feel guilty about that. I'm sure that once I have this baby, I will struggle with some of the same things that she did in the book. But I look forward to showing my child an example of somebody who is able to have their own life. Right? I'm having a baby, but it's not going to define me, and it's not going to be the only thing. And I want the child, he or she, to see an example of a working mom who is not having it all. I don't think that that's the goal, but for them to see that you can forge your own path, and you're going to get it wrong sometimes, and that's okay.
So I just got to tell you, on behalf of your mom and all of your mom's friends who have watched you grow up, we are so proud of you, Laura Jarrett. Thank you. Thank you.
Have fun. Now you can ask her the hard questions.
Laura Jarrett. Woo! All right, now I'm a little misty, right?
So proud of her. She's all grown up. She's
so amazing.
She was never very shy, but like I was. When she was 3, she would introduce herself to people in the elevator and go, "Hi, my name is Laura Jarrett. What's your name?" And I'd go, "I can't believe she's talking to strangers." And her 4th grade teachers there, Vicky Camberos, am I right? Was she not an outgoing kid?
Well, Finding Your Voice, is the title of the book. And there's all sorts of examples on finding your voice. And I want to pluck out one, which is back to City Hall days that you talk about. And we have talked about this point before, but you really describe it in the book in a way that really brings it to life and is something that I'm still in awe of. And that's the day when you went to Judd Minor, our friend, Corporation Counsel, and did something that so few women really do, and that is go in there, stand up for yourself, and demand a promotion. So tell us about that.
All right, so When I joined city government, I just went in as a staff attorney. I didn't have any title. I was so anxious to get out of that law firm. I didn't care about title or any of that kind of stuff. And I had the good fortune of being in the law department, and my client, my primary client, worked in the mayor's office. And so I was doing finance and development matters in the law department, and she was in charge of finance and development in the mayor's office. And she took me under her wing. Her name is Lucille Dobbins. And she was introduced to me by Alvin Charity, the same person who talked me into going to city government. And I think he said to her, look out for Valerie. She's so miserable. She needs somebody to buck her up. And my confidence wasn't what it should have been. And Lucille, she supported me in more ways that I could mention. Crazy things, like finally I worked up the nerve, because she was a little intimidating. There were a lot of folks who were scared to death of Lucille. Investment bankers would just wither in front of her. And I watched all that. So I said, you know what, Lucille, I really got to start trying to get home by bedtime. And there's this misconception that people who work in the public sector don't work hard. Let me tell you, public servants are public servants. They work very hard, and my hours were long. And so I said, I'll work after dinner, but I've just got to go home and at least see Laura and put her to bed. And Lucille said, well, you know what? You live on my way home. How about you get a head start, put Laura to bed, and then I'll come by and I'll work from your house and we can work there. What client does that for you? It was crazy. Now, I did start fixing her dinner too, so she got something out of it, I will say. But it just enabled me to have a little bit more flexibility. But what Tina is alluding to is, after a couple of years of working together, one afternoon, we were sitting in Alvin Charity's conference room at then Hopkins and Sutter, and Alvin had continued to be outside counsel after he had left his job at the city. And out of nowhere, Lucille said, you should go and ask Judd for a promotion. And I looked at her like she was crazy. And she says, actually, come to think of it, you should ask for a double promotion. Your boss should report to you. I thought she lost her mind. And I said, Lucille, there's no way I'm going to do that. I said, I'm sure when Judd thinks I am worthy of a promotion, he'll give me one. And she said, Judd's not thinking about you. You better go in there and fight for yourself. Well, I put it completely out of my mind. I thought that's ridiculous. Well, every 4 or 5 days, every week, Lucille would say, have you talked to Judd? Have you talked to Judd? Have you talked to Judd? Finally, I thought, I'm just going to get this over with so she stops bugging me, because I began to think she was getting disappointed in me for not doing it. So I finally make an appointment to see him, and I go in there, and I have my notes about why I had deserved this double promotion, all of which I thought was ludicrous. And I make my case, and Judd is looking at me over his eyeglasses the whole time, doesn't say a word. And then he looks up and he goes, okay. And I said, okay. And then I said, well, and I think, there's an empty office up by your front suite of 3 offices. I think I ought to move in there. And he looks at me like I'm nuts. He said, Valerie, you're like the low man on the totem pole. There are like 10 other deputies with more seniority than you. I said, yeah, but you don't have a woman up there, and I think it would be good for you to look like you support diversity in the workplace. I don't know where all this came from. I was just like, so why don't I just move in? And he said, no. And I said, well, who are you going to put in there? He said, I haven't made up my mind. And so I said, well, how about this? I'll just go move in, and then when you pick somebody, I promise I'll move out. Well, I never moved out. Never moved out. So I come back and I tell my best buddy, Susan Curlin, who also came from a private law firm, way over-credentialed with more experience. And I said, Susan, I just asked for a promotion. You should go ask for a promotion. And Susan goes, I can't ask for a promotion. When Judd thinks I need a promotion, he'll give one to me. And I said, Susan, I did it, you can too. And guess what? He said yes to Susan as well. Now, the interesting part of the story, I think, other than you just have to be your own advocate, is fast forward. And I gave my book to Mrs. Obama's chief of staff, not Tina, but the one who's her chief of staff now, to read before we published it, just to make sure that I did some fact checking. And so Melissa Winter comes back to me and she said, the book was great, but it seemed too easy when you asked for that promotion. It just doesn't make sense to me. So I started thinking about it. And then I thought, well, let me call all the people who are in the book and warn them about what I say about them in the book before it comes out. So I called Lucille and I said, Lucille, I haven't talked to you in a while. I just want to tell you what's in the book. And I explained to her what was in it. And I said, did you say anything to Judd before I asked for that promotion? And she laughed and she said, I might have. I I never knew. I thought I did it myself. And then it all made perfectly good sense. She kept bugging me to do it because she knew that when I did do it, he would say yes, because she'd already gone and talked to him and advocated for me. And so not only was she my mentor, but she advocated for me when I wasn't in the room. And we always need people who will go to bat for us when we aren't there. But she wanted me to have to ask for it. And that was an important lesson, too. So I learned a lot from Lucille.
Well, yeah, there's so much in that story. And there's so much in that story because, and we used to talk about that story a lot in the White House, right? Because one of the things that we worked on was through the Council on Women and Girls. One of the things that you and I did together for 8 years was running the White House Council on Women and Girls in the Obama White House and doing things like starting United State of Women, and was the Working Families Agenda and how we need to empower women to go ask, do that. We learned that, a lot of the problems around equal pay are because we don't ask enough, and companies also don't give it and don't pay attention to it. So let's be clear, this is not all about women just asking. But that was, a lot of your working life really informed a lot of that policy work we were able to do.
Well, I think for both of us, because we were working moms, single moms, Tina and I both were, but look at it, we had means. We had good jobs, we had health insurance, we had childcare, quality childcare that we could afford without having to cut something else in our life. We didn't have to worry about where our next meal was coming from, and yet we both still felt like we were hanging on by our fingertips. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, but I think early on it made me think about, well, what about those working families where parents are working a double shift and they don't leave their children but through no fault of their own, in circumstances where they don't have to worry about them, and they don't know how they're going to make ends meet. And I thought, shouldn't we be doing something for those working families? And I also thought, intuitively, and our evidence proved it to be true, that if employers really want to hire and retain the best talent possible, shouldn't they be making it a little bit easier on working families? Shouldn't they care about equal pay and paid leave? We're the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a paid leave policy, a national paid leave policy. 43 million Americans don't have a single paid sick day. If Laura got sick, or if there was a Halloween parade, if I didn't show up, there was nobody there. And so I needed to have a job where I had the flexibility to be a mom. And so why shouldn't everybody have that flexibility? And why should people have to worry about going into an environment where they're worried about being sexually assaulted or violence or treated horribly? And so we really spent a lot of time looking at these basket of issues we called working family issues, and encouraging employers to look at it not as a nice to do for women, but as a business imperative that's good for working families, but also makes us globally competitive. Because let's face it, now you can live anywhere in the world and work from wherever, right? And if we're competing with companies that have great paid leave policies and wonderful benefits, we're going to lose the talent to them. And so evidence does show that companies that invest are have a more productive, more efficient, more loyal workforce, less turnover, and in the private sector, more profitable. And then we tried to adopt those policies in probably the most high-tension place in the world, the White House, and lead by example. And the President and the First Lady both encouraged everybody in the White House to be a whole person. Bring your kids to work with you. Let them run around in the Rose Garden and play on the Jungle Gym. Demystify what's happening when they're not with you. And that was part of why I brought Laura to work. And Mayor Daley actually taught me a very good lesson. Actually, wasn't so much the mayor. He did it by example, but Maggie was the enforcer. I had brunch with the Daleys one Sunday, and Maggie said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going back to work." And she said, "Why do you work on Sundays?" And I said, "Well, I got a lot to do. I'm the Commissioner of Planning and Development." And she goes, "He's the mayor. He doesn't work on Sundays." I don't let him work on Sundays. And so she said, "You should go home and be with Laura." And so I did a modification to that because I wasn't the mayor. And I only went places on Sunday where Laura was not just welcome, but where I thought it would be an interesting experience for her. And then I brought her in the office all of the time. And she's right, she played and ran up and down the halls and pretended she was who knows what, but she could imagine where I was when I wasn't with her. And then the other thing I did, which is one of the reasons that led me to Kathy Branch, is that I had a rule, and it was the same rule my mother had, which is that whenever she called, wherever I was, the call had to be put through. And I have this vivid memory of being a youngster, and my mom worked at Chicago Child Care teaching preschool before she formed Erickson Institute. And I would call her, and she'd be in the classroom. And whoever answered the phone would say, just a minute, and then I'd hear that person walking down the hall, and then I could hear my mother's footsteps getting louder and louder as she came to the phone. And she could tell within the first 10 seconds if I really needed to talk to her or what was going on, but she knew it in my voice. And so one time when I had just gotten to the Department of Planning and Development, my assistant, before I worked with Kathy, did not put Laura's call through. And I was in a closed-door meeting, and I came out, and she said, Laura called. And I said, why didn't you put the call through? And she said, you were in a meeting. And I said, but I have a rule, always put Laura through. She said, and Laura was 5 at the time. She said, Laura said it wasn't important. I said, a 5-year-old doesn't make the determination of what's important. I make that determination. And I will know in her voice whether it's important. And if she picks up the phone, by definition, it's important. And I think trying to figure out ways of giving everybody the empowerment to say that, and let's face it, a vast majority of people in the workplace don't feel comfortable setting their children in that kind of a priority. And we had the privilege of being able to do it. And so trying to push the private sector and push employers to understand how important that is if you want to be a satisfied working parent, not just mom, because fortunately Laura's generation of men are doing far more than men in my generation or the prior one did. And that's good for them and their relationships with their children. And I think ultimately it's good for society.
Right. Well, and they need the flexibility too.
Yes, they do. And the point I was making about our White House is that starting at the top, and tone does start at the top, we reinforce that message. And so when senior women and men took 3 months of paid maternity or paternity leave, equal for men and women, I want to say, it sent a message throughout the organization that that was part of our culture. And I think there are a lot of companies that have rules on their books, but everybody knows you actually can't take that time because people will think you're not committed. And we wanted to make it clear, hey, Abby, I didn't see you, that you are able to do it.
And we're continuing that work, right? Through United States of Women.
So the White House Council on Women and Girls did not continue in the new administration. Not sure why, but we gave them a grace period, and when it was clear that they were not going to continue it, and we probably would have done this anyway, Tina and I formed a not-for-profit called the United States of Women, named after the last summit we had in the summer of 2016 at the White House, where we focused on all of the ways in which we tried to improve gender equity over the course of 8 years, but more importantly, the work that lies ahead. And then last summer, we had an amazing summit in Los Angeles, which culminated in showcasing all of the work that's going on around the country. And we've always believed that change happens on the ground, and it's great if you have somebody in Washington that's helped spurring it on, but we are perfectly capable of doing it without them. And so that's a big piece of what Tina and I do now.
UnitedStatesOfWomen.org. A little plug. So I want to talk about race. The book has sort of amazing, I think, observations through the eyes of your parents and then you and then the president. You know, just that generational differences that I think is a real story of race in America and an evolution. And you talk about sort of the difference, sort of your mother's attitude about toughening you up, her disbelief that, you know, Senator Obama could ever win that race, and talk about a little bit how differently your parents thought about race from the way perhaps you and President Obama thought about race.
Yeah, so I spent some time on this, and maybe I'll start at the end and then work my way backwards. So the weekend after the 2008 election, President and Mrs. Obama-elect, if that's what they were called, were on 60 Minutes. And this is back where 60 Minutes was still a really big deal. And so
we won't tell 60 Minutes you said that.
I didn't mean it like that. I meant like them being on it was like phenomenal. Now he's been on it I don't know how many times. So this was like one of the first, it was the first time they'd been on it together.
Right.
I'm not slamming 60 Minutes. I love 60 Minutes. Grew up watching 60 Minutes. So anyway, my dad had been very, very ill, and he was at Northwestern's rehab center. And so the three of us were there in his hospital room watching them on 60 Minutes, and they were just magical. I don't know if any of you remember it the way I do, but they reminded me of the young couple I had met back in 1991, full of love for each other, respect for each other, sitting next to each other, talking about this historic moment. And it was so amazing, and at the very end of it, you could have heard a pin drop in my dad's room. And my mother looked at me, and for those of you who know my mother, you know that she's laughing already. Anna's laughing already. She knows her well, works with her. She kind of looks at the world like the glass is not just half empty, but like 3/4 empty. And you've got to plan accordingly and think of like the worst possible thing that can happen. And then if you figure out what to do then you're going to be maybe okay. Whereas my dad and I are like, you know what, I just assume everything's going to work out, and if it doesn't, well, that's okay. We'll bounce back, and we'll have another plan. And my mother looks at us like we're from a foreign part of space. So anyway, she looks at me, and she said, how did you know that he could win? Not even that he would win, but even that he could win. And I said, because you raised me to believe that if I worked twice as hard and I had a dream and I went for my dream and I didn't give up and I was resilient despite all odds and I had a little bit of luck, that anything was possible. And she said, well, I never believed that. And my father starts to chuckle and he goes, yeah, me either. And it was in that moment that I realized that Barbara and Jimmy Bowman had raised me aspirationally. Not as the world that they knew, and I'll explain that in a minute, but as they hoped it would be for me. And although my mother peppered that with, doom and gloom could come, she made me think anything was possible. And I think a piece of that began when my parents left this country. So when my father and mother married, my father was finishing his residency and he joined the Army. And when he left the Army, he was in Denver for a couple of years, he tried to find a job at an academic teaching institution in the United States. And he couldn't find one where his pay was equivalent to his white counterparts. And so he and my mom are adventuresome spirits, to say the least. And so they started looking at opportunities outside of the United States, and neither of them had been any further than Europe, and only there once on their honeymoon a year after they got married and took my grandmother with. So they were not used to like wandering the world alone. And a position came to their attention that was to start a new hospital in a city called Shiraz, Iran, and they offered my dad chairman of the Department of Pathology. And against, their parents and relatives, everybody saying, what are you doing? You can't pick up and leave. They picked up and left. And I was born a year and a half or so later. I was the second baby born in the Namazi hospital. They practiced on some other baby first. We don't know how that poor child is doing, but I came along second. And we lived there till I was 5. And my father did research on all kinds of research in Iran, and he used to always say that he had been invited there by the government of Iran, together with physicians from all over the world, to share best practices. And he used to correct me when I would ever say, well, they were going to provide Western medicine. And he said, no, he learned as much from the Iranian doctors as they learned from him, and he encountered diseases there that we didn't have here. And so from there, his research caught the attention of the guy who ran the Galton Labs at University College of London. And so after 5 years, my parents decided it was time to start migrating back to the United States for a whole range of reasons. And so they went to London for a year, sent their dog to come and stay with my grandmother and my cousin Jeff and his parents and siblings, because he couldn't take a dog, my precious dog, to London because they had to quarantine him. So send the dog home, and they thought they'd be there in a year. But he didn't know what he would do at the end of that year, having in the back of his mind what it was like when he left. But I will say, going to Iran, he stopped being a black doctor. He was an American doctor. And it was based on merit, and they were glad to have him there. And there was it was colorblind. There may have been a lot of other issues in Iran, but color and race were not among them. And that's where I had the beginning of my life, was in that environment. So once in London, he gives a speech about his research at some international conference. And the dean of the University of Chicago Medical Center was at that conference and offered him a tenure track position right here at the University of Chicago. And so my dad used to always say to me, sometimes the shortest distance to where you want to go might be the longest way around. Now, you don't always have to go around the other side of the world to get to what you want, but you have to be willing to. And I think it was his first lesson in like swerving outside of your comfort zone, and that's where the adventure is, and that's what life is all about. And to feel that you don't have to feel fearless. Fear is okay. You just have to have the courage to do it. And it changed my life and shaped my view of race. And so when I came back to the United States, and Jeff could tell you this, my goodness, here I am, 5 years old, fair skin, freckles, red hair, like my cousin Becky, who's here. We're the only redheads in the family in our generation. And they plopped me down at Shoesmith Elementary School. It was predominantly black public school. And I got placed into second grade, so 2 years ahead of myself. Well, I used to get peed up every single day for a whole range of reasons. Oh, and I speak with a British accent, because 1 year is enough to develop a British accent. And I'm from a country nobody'd ever heard of. And Jeffrey's younger sister, Lauren, who was 6 months younger and about 10 pounds lighter, used to have to pull the bullies off of me and defend me every day, which was humiliating after school. And it was kind of a culture shock to me. And from my parents, particularly from my mom, she's going back home. She's around the corner from her mom and her sister and her cousins. And everybody's like, this is familiar. And to me, it was a foreign country. And so it took me a minute to kind of get used to it. I dropped that accent like the first week. Sadly, I stopped speaking Farsi. I wish I'd kept it up. And my mom would speak in public because she was so proud she learned this new language, and it would embarrass me. Because like a kid, I just wanted to be like every other kid. And I was not like every other kid. I was weird. I had a whole different background. And I think part of what I try to say to young people is that, own your story. Whatever your story is, own it. It's what makes you who you are. And it took me a while to really appreciate that this kind of unusual childhood had so dramatically shaped my perspective on the world. I mean, I felt like I could play with anybody, and then I could work with anybody because I played with people from all over the world as a child, and it gave me an appreciation for the United States that sometimes you don't have if you've never been out of here, living in an undeveloped country where you have to boil all of your liquids and you have to peel all of your fruits and vegetables, and you don't have the same civil liberties, quite frankly, that we have here. And then you also learn that the United States is already the greatest country on earth. I know.
It's already great. Already great.
But it's not the only country on earth, and that you can learn a great deal outside of the United States. But that wasn't my parents' experience. They grew up, and my dad segregated Washington, D.C., my mom segregated Chicago, lived under restrictive covenants where my grandparents had to live only in a certain community, and my grandfather managed was called the Rosenwald Building at 46 in Michigan, and you had doctors, you had Pullman porters, you had barbers, you had everybody living in the building, mixed in terms of income because everybody had to live in that community. And so their frame of reference was very different than the frame of reference they gave me.
And you sum it up. You have a great line, which I want to get right in the book, that sums kind of your parents' experience, but is also this bridge to sort of what President Obama was doing in the White House. And your line is, that Black Americans have always been pragmatic revolutionaries, which I thought was so insightful. And talk, that as evidence of your dad going to Iran, figuring the other way around to get what he wanted. But that also influenced how President Obama sort of approached the White House, right, and his administration.
Well, he always said you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And that you have to have a vision, and you have to stay true to your core values and ideals, and you have to have a moral compass that points only in one direction, true north, but that you have to be willing to, try to get things done. And sometimes change is incremental. Almost always change is incremental. And I think he got that from really being a pragmatist. And people often misinterpreted him.
Right.
And they thought, well, you're giving in, or it's weakness, and why are you not going for 100% of what you want? And he's like, in this big, diverse country, you've got people with all kinds of ideas, and we have to have a big, inclusive tent, which means that, you might not get the public option for the Affordable Care Act.
The ACA, yep.
There were a lot of people who criticized us. You have to have a public option. It's the only thing that will work. And he said, you know what? At the end, when he was still getting criticized, 20 million people have health care who didn't have it before. Yeah. Everybody's covered with pre-existing conditions. Young kids can stay on their parents' plans till they're 26. Women can get preventive care without a copay. Senior citizens are not forced to cut their medicine in half because they can't afford it. I mean, no lifetime or annual caps. I could give you the whole spiel on the Affordable Care Act, but the point is that there was a lot of pressure on him. First of all, to quit trying to get it done at all because it was burning through political capital and it wasn't popular. And he said, this isn't a popularity contest. I'm trying to do something bold and important. And there's never been anything bold that was done in our country that wasn't without controversy. I mean, Social Security, when it first passed, it was controversial. Medicare, Medicaid, you name it. So he was willing to kind of take on the controversy, but he wasn't willing to say it has to be my way or the highway. And we spent an enormous amount of time getting caught trying to work with the Republicans because he thought this was really important that, I mean, because people, and even now people are like, well, why would you work with them? Well, they represent a part of our country. And he was never just president of his base, he was president of the country. And that's the way he thought he had to behave. And the way you work with the country is through their elected representatives. And then you also encourage the people to get involved and to participate and put pressure on their elected representatives too. And that doesn't happen as much as it should.
So we're going to do a little kind of like our experiences in the White House a little bit before we get to questions, but we're going to do questions in a few minutes. So start thinking about, questions you all may have, and there's going to be mic runners coming through the audience. But some of our shared experiences, and one of the ones that I sort of cannot believe you wrote about, but we talked about a lot and lived through is, so we were probably the two women, among the senior staff, the only two who went through menopause in the White House. And it was a whole thing. We both had the experience, a whole thing. I have a story in the Oval. You've got your stories you write about in the book. Talk about us going through menopause in a sea of, as Abby Witt and other people will testify, sort of 30-somethings.
Well, so the campaign worked in 2008 because we had all of these inspirational young people just like Abby who worked so hard to make magic happen. And then we hired them all in the White House. And so Tina and I were two of the oldest people in the White House. And we were older, obviously, than the president and the first lady. And we were older than really like 95% of the people there, maybe 99% of the people there. And I think my heart flashes started like a week before I got there. And you'd sit in a room full of young people, and Tina and I had different approaches to our hot flashes. Mine made me very self-conscious, and they always were like, I feel this sweat kind of going down my face, and I'd say, well, maybe nobody sees it. And then I would feel it, so I said, well, if I feel it, they probably see it. So I would creep my hand up, and then I would say, well, maybe they don't notice that my hair is soaking wet and stuck to my forehead. And one of my more painful moments was sitting in the limousine with President Obama going somewhere, I don't know where, and he's from Hawaii, so he likes it hot all the time. And so in the normal conditions, his car was hot. And when you're having a hot flash, it's really hot. And I sat there, and I don't know what I did because he was reading, and I don't know whether he just felt me squirm or whether I was radiating heat, but he reaches down and he pulls out a handkerchief, and he hands it to me. He doesn't look at me. He hands it to me, and he turns the air conditioning on.
Without looking up. He's
he
still
never
reading.
Looked at
He
me.
never
He
looked
never
up.
said a word. But then there were other times where he would come up to me, just like start patting me down in front of a crowd. I was like, stop it. And so just like only a brother could do for you. But what Tina and I thought is like, we should be able to talk about this. This is a normal thing that happens to women. Women in this room, your moms, your daughters, it happens. And somehow we make women feel uncomfortable being honest about what is happening. And so we tried to demystify it in the White House and be more open about it. And one of the highlights, I had a few, maybe just last year, Erickson Institute, where my mom works, had its 50th anniversary. And there's a young woman named, well, not so young, woman named Valerie, my name, who was to introduce my mother. And she goes out on the stage, and just as she goes out, because often they're triggered by public speaking, she starts to have a hot flash. And so she's sweating, just like those of you who saw Samantha in, what's it called? Sex and the City, thank you. Profusely, and she says, her opening remarks are, hot flashes are the devil. And everybody laughed, as they should. You should tell your story about being in the Oval Office with a hot flash.
Yes. All right. That's my story, which, you can now hear because I'm never writing a book. But we were in the Oval. We were actually, thank God, not in a meeting. We were doing it was a going away party for someone. And we're all standing around and it just comes, right? It's just, I'm dripping. So I grab some piece of paper and I'm doing this thing. And he looks at me, he says, you hot? I said, I'm having a hot flash. Well, the men in the room are kind of a little uncomfortable. He's, of course, fine. Actually, some of the younger women were kind of uncomfortable. And one of the younger women, we go back out into the outer Oval when we're done. And she said, did we just talk about hot flashes in the Oval Office? I'm like, yes, that's my life. That's what we're going through. Of course we are. And that's what we sort of need to do. We need to do about menopause, demystify this.
But we also said, and I used humor in my book to try to get hooks to get people to understand that I think Tina and I were of the age where we really appreciated every single day the privilege of working in the White House. And not Abby, but some of the young people, they worked on the campaign. Everybody said he wouldn't win. He then wins. And then they get a job in the White House, and they work there for a number of years. And they're spoiled. They think, oh, this is how life is going to be.
Right.
And Tina and I kept saying, you guys don't understand. And several of them would leave and go on to what they thought was like greener pastures. You couldn't have pried Tina and I out of that White House. The last day at about 11:59.
Yes.
Tina and I they were pulling our devices out of our hands.
We were the last ones, the last tranche.
Literally the last people to leave. We had watched the president and first lady receive the flag that was flown on the first day he was in office and the last day. And we weren't prepared for that, so we start bawling right away. And then we watched the new administration, the president-elect and vice president-elect come in, and we're trying to be wallflowers and not be seen. We watched President Obama introduce the new president to the House staff, which was very painful to think about, particularly like the older black butlers and valets who'd been, just imagine, they'd been there for decades. They finally get to work for the first black president. And to see him handing it off was really hard for them and for us. And then we watched them say goodbye.
When they took the new president's
Yes,
coat.
he took his coat off. I was like, oh, don't take that coat off. Make him hang up his own coat. Why you got to take the coat off for him? To myself, it was that bubble. I didn't say a word out loud. And then we go to return our stuff, and then for some kind of macabre humor, I don't know what, we're walking through the colonnade for the last time, and they've already taken President Obama's stuff out of the Oval Office. The rug is wrapped up, the furniture is folded. We look at each other, we don't say a word. We're like, oh my gosh, we got to get out of here. And then after we turn in our devices, for reasons I will never understand, we peek in the Oval Office, and it's no longer our Oval Office. And it's, we've got different curtains, different rug, different furniture, and a place that we walked in the door thinking, kind of with the imposter syndrome, how could we possibly be here on the first day, January 20th of 2009, and here it is on the last day, and we realize it's no longer our home, and that's the way it is. It's temporary.
Yeah.
You don't own it. Well, we all own it, but you don't really own it in the sense of belonging, working there. And then we left.
Yeah. Well, talk about the first day, though. We did this backwards. But, that was the last day. And that first week, our first week with Kathy Branch as part of that story, what happened? It was the Friday. It was the last day of that first work week.
Well, just remember, when President Obama took office, we were in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We've got 2 wars going on. You got Osama bin Laden, where he's somewhere and we don't know where he is, trying to find him. You have a dependence on foreign oil, which is skewing our world's markets and not good for our national security either. You have a healthcare crisis, energy crisis of confidence around the world. And here we get plopped down, and it's like a startup. When we walked in the first day, I don't like the cold, so I didn't go to the parade. Don't tell anybody that, but I did not go to the parade. I went in to find my office because it was warm inside.
And then you stole the furniture out of the rest of our offices, too.
I did steal.
She stole all the best furniture.
I did. I was terrible. I was like, I'm first one here, and my furniture just looked ridiculous. And so Tina's office was next door to me, so I was, I like her desk. She won't ever know that I have her desk. So I took her desk and took Cecilia something else, but we really called it drinking out of a fire hose, and everything was chaotic, and it was all new, and And so at the end of the first week, on a Friday, it's Tina and I were next door to each other. Tina came in my office, and Tina and Kathy Branch and I had worked together since 1991. So the city, to the Habitat Company, to the White House. And so she's like my sister, my younger sister, I have to say. She's like family. And so the three of us who've known each other 30 years practically at that point are all sitting together and laughing. And Tina...
You're not gonna do
Exactly.
this.
I know, because you just did it. Okay, so that's how she laughs, right? So you can hear her laugh like a mile away.
Which is what the president used to yell at me about all the time.
He'd say, Tina must be coming down the hall. I hear the laugh coming. So Tina's laughing, and we're all pitching ourselves that we're actually working there. And who strolls into my office but the president? And he was exploring too, just like we were. And he was wandering up, trying to figure out, well, who's up here in what office? And so he comes in and he chats with us for a minute, and then he says to Kathy and to Tina, have you seen the Oval Office? Now, I'd gone in there on the first day, and I was like this. I mean, I couldn't believe it. We were having a meeting, and I was like, it's a very pretty ceiling. Nobody tells you that. The ceiling is beautiful. And I was like, so he said to Tina and Kathy, have you been to the Oval Office? Well, of course they hadn't. So he says, come on down. And so we start to go down, and Kathy didn't move at first. Yeah. And he's like, Kathy? I said, come on down. So we go to the Oval Office, and if you can imagine these, the four of us from Chicago sitting with the president, he's one of the four of us sitting in the Oval, and then in walks Michelle Obama.
Yep.
And she sits down, and it's just like home week back when we were all in the Department of Planning and Development, and they
but
were
a little different living room.
A very different living room, but it just felt it put us all at ease. And then finally he says, well, I have to get back to work. And so we all jump up. Well, I should say Kathy, Tina, and I jump up. Michelle Obama goes, no, I'm not ready to leave yet. So we sit back down. And it was incredible. Every single day.
It was
incredible.
It was amazing. So as we finish up, just before questions, do you have a most extraordinary day? Do you have a day that you go back to?
Every single day was pretty extraordinary. And I tell a story, which I'll abbreviate for the sake of time, of trying to ground myself every day and remind myself like how important it was to make every second count. Because even if it's either 4 or 8 years, but even 8 years, the days lasted forever, but the weeks and months and years flew by. And because we were older, we knew that, we had context. And so I would come through the gates of the White House, and I would think of this man I met on the campaign trail, and he had given President Obama a military patch from his uniform. And President Obama didn't want to accept it, and the man was like, I've carried this for 40 years. And I served in the military and protected our country. I have had some tough times in life, and it made me have courage and confidence, and I want you to have it. And this was before people started handing newborn babies through a mosh pit for him to hold and take a photo. I never understood the newborn, but don't do that with the newborn baby, Laura. They just go, here, Mr. President.
Over the barrier. They're like, you can't find the mom, return the baby.
Yeah.
We had those. Yep.
So this was before any of that started happening. And so I thought, well, let me think of him every single day when I come through the gates of the White House and try to do something to make him proud and make giving up that treasured possession worthwhile. And I used to tell this story all the time, and a reporter heard about it. And before the second inauguration, she said, I want to find that guy that you told about that story about. And my immediate reaction was, oh, no, because what if he's an axe murderer or something? And I've been having this fantasy about this wonderful, generous man for 4 years. So I wouldn't help her, but she was a really industrious reporter. And she found him in Austin, Texas. He was now the head of security for the Hyatt Hotel down there. And she sends me his email, and I tell this story about how I wrote him a note saying, I'm the person who started crying in the elevator when you gave President Obama your patch, and I've thought about you every day for 4 years, and I just wanted to let you know that. And he wrote me right back, and he said, yes, I remember you. You were the one, crying in the elevator. And it was my privilege, and President Obama, never for one day, has made me regret having given up that possession. And so I told President Obama the story, and he said, well, why don't you invite him to the second inauguration? So his name was Earl Smith. So Mr. Smith came to Washington.
Yeah.
And it was great. It was so cool. And the day after the inauguration, President Obama invited him to the Oval Office, and Mr. Smith walked into the Oval Office, and he was laughing with me out front. He was just as wonderful as I had imagined him to be. And he walks into the office and he pulls himself strong and tall, and he salutes President Obama. And of course, I burst into tears all over.
Well, it's making me cry. It made me cry when I read the book, and it's making me cry right now. Right.
And then finally, he was invited to the final State of the Union to sit in Mrs. Obama's box as an example of what this was really all about. And so I tell a story about an ordinary person because it's those ordinary people that really makes up this extraordinary country. But the most profound day, I think the one that I'll remember forever, was when we were trying to predict the Supreme Court, which you cannot do. You can't predict the outcome, you can't predict when the decisions will come down, but they do tend to put the controversial decisions at the end of the term. And so at the end of the term, in 2015, we had kind of forgotten that they might come down with a controversial decision because they had just ruled on the Affordable Care Act the day before. And so we thought, well, they won't do anything else until the following week. And I was sitting in the Chief of Staff's office when my assistant comes in with a note that says that the Supreme Court ruled on marriage equality 5-4 in our favor. And we were so excited, we were jubilant, and the Chief of Staff said, go down and tell the president, because my team, beginning with Tina heading up public engagement, had worked on LGBTQ issues from the very beginning. So I run down to the Oval Office to tell President Obama, and he's not there. And so I come back dejected, and Dennis said, well, what did he say? And I said, he wasn't
early.
there.
He didn't get down early.
Well, it's about 10:10. It's not that early, but it was right after they had ruled. So he said, well, call him on the phone. So his assistant dials the White House operator, and I pick up the phone, and President Obama answers the phone and says, what? And I was like, well, you usually don't use that tone of voice with me, but it threw me off a little bit. And so I said, well, sir, I was calling to let you know that the marriage equality decision came down today 5-4. And there's a pregnant pause, and he said, and who won? I was like, darn it, I buried the lead. You messed me up with that what? And so I said, we did. And he said, oh, it's been an incredible week. Well, the reason why he was sharp with me was because he was upstairs working on yet another eulogy for Reverend Pinckney, who had been murdered the week before, together with 8 parishioners from Charleston. And we were getting ready to go to Charleston that day. So then if you can imagine the chaos that ensued, the team is outside building the platform, I guess, for the speech he has to give about marriage equality now. I'm trying to get the plaintiffs from the case on the phone so he can congratulate them on winning. He's still working on the eulogy, and it's just chaos. And normally when we have a press conference in the Rose Garden, there was an unwritten rule that staff should just not come because you're supposed to be busy. You're working in the White House. You shouldn't be hanging out in the Rose Garden. Everybody watches it on their television up in their office, but you're not supposed to be seen. That day, the colonnade was packed full of young staff who wanted to be there to see this moment of history. And so then we go off to Charleston. He warns his wife and I that he might sing Amazing Grace. And I learned a lesson a while ago because I had encouraged him not to sing Al Green at a fundraiser. And he sang it, and it was great, and it broke the internet.
Went viral.
Right, you remember that? Yes, well, I was the one backstage saying, don't do that. So this time I'm like, sing, whatever moves you. And what we had anticipated being just the most depressing ceremony possible was a celebration of life. And these are the families, I would remind you, who the day or two after this violent murder by a 21-year-old were in court at his arraignment saying, we forgive you. Yeah. And that was all about Amazing Grace. And then we fly back home, and a young person on our team had suggested a few weeks earlier that we light the White House up with a rainbow. And she started by saying, you're probably going to think this is a terrible idea. I know it probably won't work. It wasn't even really my idea. It was somebody in the press office's idea. But what do you think about this? And I'm like, that's a great idea. I don't know if we can do it. So then I called Tina, and I said, we have a great idea. Can you figure out how to do it? And she does. And so
it's actually not so easy to light things like that. So we did a little test on the back of the White House in secret so that no one would know.
So we knew it would work. And then I tweeted out something like, look at the White House, something so people would not really know what we were talking about. And then Tina and I spent the entire evening on the north colonnade of the White House watching the sun go down and the lights that started out very pale turn into this brilliant rainbow, and people from all over heard about it on the news or walked by and saw it. And so Lafayette Park, which is in front of the White House, was packed, solid, and forever I will have in my mind the photograph of that iconic moment. That was the most extraordinary day.
Yeah. Valerie Jarrett. So we've got time for a couple of questions. Raise your hand, and we've got mic runners right here.
Tina, Valerie.
Hey there.
Hey.
Yep. Stand up, Thomas.
The one thing that you all, neither of you have mentioned, and just wondered if you could talk about the experience. First time on Marine One and Air Force One.
Well, you'll have to read my book. I'm serious. I talk about it at length in the book. Well, first of all, how crazy is it to say I have a preference? Marine One is so much cooler, I think, than Air Force One. And that just sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? And the reason why is you see things in Marine One that you couldn't possibly see anywhere else, like when the pilots would take us around the Statue of Liberty a couple of times, and you're just so close, you feel you can touch it. Or on our way to Andrews Air Force Base when we go by the Washington Monument, and the first time we did it, he said, look out the window, and I said, yeah, it's amazing. He goes, no, look right now. And then boom, this close to me is the Washington Monument. Or this time of year to see the cherry blossoms over the tidal basin. And the first time I went out not to ride on it, but just to watch it take off, because you've seen that takeoff and landing on television 1,000 times. I went out to go and watch, and because I could. I thought, I can go do that. He's going off on Marine One. And just as I was about to walk outside, one of the Secret Service agents said to me, it gets a bit windy out there. And I thought, okay, thank you very much. And I go outside. A bit windy means every piece of dust within a mile around swirls around you. I had dust in my eyes, in my hair. It was a gritty mess, and I'm standing there trying to look like, and so that took the mystique off of watching. And getting on it is perilous too. And I rarely wear high heels. I did this for you guys. I never wear them anymore. But back then I did, and the first time you try to walk, I don't know, what is it, 50 feet in grass with an entire press corps watching you in high heels, and you tell me, well, you men won't understand this, but the women will, you know you're gonna walk out of those shoes. At some point, you're gonna walk out of your shoes. And every time I would get to the stairs, and we would walk together like tight, there was like an unwritten rule, if you fall, pick them up right away. Don't let them just lay there on the ground with the cameras going, because the cameras are shooting, hoping you fall. And one time, every time I would get to the stairs, I'd say a little prayer, and I'd go, thank God I'm on the stairs, and I'd hold on tight. But one time I said the prayer too soon, because I started to walk up the stairs, and I made a mistake. I didn't do this again. I had on a loose dress as opposed to a tight dress. And along came a wind right up under my dress, and I could feel it going up. And fortunately, one of the nicest things Rahm Emanuel ever did for me, pulled down my dress.
Is there another one? Right.
We have a question here in the center.
Good evening. Thank you both for being with us tonight. This has been great. My name is Randall Blakey. I'm the executive pastor at LaSalle Street Church, and I'm interested in knowing, Ms. Jarrett, whether or not there was a life or daily practice, discipline, that you practiced when you got up in the morning and when you went to sleep in the evening.
Our whole day was about discipline. I mean, I will say, again, that our administration believed that the most precious thing we had, for example, was time. That was really the most, and his time paramount. And so we organized our entire day to try to get to the point where we could make a recommendation to him that was reasoned, vetted, consulted with whatever stakeholders might be impacted by the decision, and take as little of his time as possible, and use it as judiciously as we could. And then the other way that discipline comes into it is that we all had to figure out how to keep the stamina up to make it through what's really a marathon. And everybody's different. And so some people it would be prayer. Some people it would be exercise. Some people it would be like Susan and I would go have brunch every Sunday and sit around and talk for a few hours. Everybody had something different that they had to do to ground themselves and give them the sense of structure and order and discipline and resilience. Because let's face it, when you put yourself in that arena, you're going to take a lot of incoming. And a very famous pastor said to me once when I was ranting and raving about some injustice, and he just was stopping by the office to say hello. He wasn't expecting all that. And he said, Valerie, part of leadership is learning how to absorb pain without letting it eat you alive or making you numb. And I thought he said that really well. And I went down and I said it to President Obama. And so it became almost like a running thing when things were going really bad. We'd go, well, it's time to absorb some pain here. But when you are leading, you see something that everybody else doesn't necessarily see at the same time. And it's, as I said earlier, it's not a popularity contest. And so you have to be willing to take the short-term heat for the long-term gain. And one of the observations I would make, and I know Tina shares this, coming from Chicago, okay, you guys, we know we're a little rough and tumble here in politics, right? Just had a big election yesterday. But you had a unity, or day before yesterday, but then you had a unity breakfast the next day. And we all do just love this city and want it to be great and strong, and we might disagree sometimes about how to get it there, but we all know we love the city. And I think what I was unprepared for, perhaps naively so, was that in Washington there are people who simply put their short-term political interests ahead of you. And that's not why President Obama ran for office. That's not what he was looking to do. And so there was this tension between differences in strategies, and it was somewhat diabolical because they just said, we'll just say no. We'll take the president that's all about hope and change, and we'll just say, we won't work with you. And that's not a democracy. That's not the way our branches of government were designed to work together. And so I think it took a fair amount for us to finally appreciate the fact that no matter what we did, privately, quietly, inviting them to this or that, that wasn't their strategy. But I think it was important to get caught trying. And I think it was important for us to go through that exercise, but it was a painful exercise, and we wasted precious time trying to get them to come to the table when they were never going to come to the table. But President Obama's attitude was, to get Congress to act creates sustainable change. So the reason the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land is because you couldn't reverse it with an executive order. The reason why Don't Ask, Don't Tell is the law of the land is because you couldn't reverse it with executive order. We couldn't get comprehensive immigration reform or the DREAM Act passed, and so he did it by executive order, and now you see all of these amazing young people who by every measure are citizens except a piece of paper, and they are living in jeopardy right now. And so we really did have no choice but to try to work with Congress, and it was always the less favorable option to do an executive order because it's so easy to reverse. And so the discipline came in having an agenda, moving forward with your agenda at the same time as you are drinking out of the fire hose with all this incoming fire, and never forgetting why you're there.
Thank you. So before we do one last question, I just want to do logistics for the crowd.
And then we'll do one question.
Right, and we're going to do one last question. And the logistics when we finish is please stay in your seats for a moment so that Valerie can go over to the signing table to sign books. And then you can go, and if you want to purchase books, there's booksellers, still in the back. And if you want to purchase a book, she will sign it, and you can then line up over by the signing table. So that's our sort of little logistical instruction.
So just give me a second to get to the back of the room,
Right.
is what she's saying.
All right. So one last question.
We have a question right back
Okay.
here.
Our one last question over here.
Hello, I'm Adama Onimo from Northfield, Mount Hermon. So I just wanted to say,
Hey!
Hello.
Jeffrey turned around. He's like, oh!
Hi.
Wait, I'm afraid to ask, what year did you finish?
oh, I didn't go. I just joined the staff a few weeks ago.
Oh, well,
Yep.
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for writing this book. It's definitely I've read through a couple pages, so much insight and wisdom as a working mom myself. So I guess my question to you is, if you could give one piece of advice, out of, I'm sure, all the lessons you've learned along the way to women trying to find their voice, what would it be?
Perfect last question.
There's a good lesson to end on. Well, so when I was young, I used to think, well, if I just worked even harder, if I were smarter, if I were better organized, if I were maybe more efficient, if I slept fewer hours, maybe this wouldn't all be so hard. And I think it's just hard, particularly when you introduce children into the scenario. It's just hard. And I think that the deck is still stacked against us. And what we really have to do is have the courage to speak up. And if you take movements like the Me Too movement, thank goodness for those brave women who came forward and talked about the most traumatic thing that could possibly happen in a public way, setting themselves up for attack. But they did it, and there is safety in numbers. Tina is now heading up the legal aspect of Time's Up. And the whole premise is, how are we going to help people so that they don't have to just have a voice out there by themselves, but they actually have a lawyer who can help them and empower them to use their voices. And I think as we think about ways of supporting one another, men are an important part of this equation. We have to lift up the voices of women and recognize their value. We have to listen. We have to listen to the needs of women in a way that men in the workforce have not traditionally had to do. And I think that it is incumbent on everybody to take that risk. And the first time you raise your hand and you say something, and maybe it's a dumb question, or maybe you're talking about being in menopause or having young children or needing a longer maternity leave, and you're afraid about your reaction, think about the fact that if you do it, you're making it a little easier for the next person, and the next person, and the next person. And I think that's part of what being a trailblazer is all about, and everybody in this room has the opportunity to be that trailblazer. And I think for the women who are now in positions of power, they have to reach back and leave the door open a little bit wider. Don't close the door behind you. Don't pull up the ladder. Make the aperture greater and nurture and support women so that we can thrive. And I just have met so many talented women, particularly in Tina and my generation, who were trying to be super women. And we were going to do everything. And we thought if we did everything, we could have everything. And that is nonsense about having it all. And if you set yourself up that way, you're going to disappoint yourself. And I can remember when I started dropping balls all over the place, my mom said to me, "Why don't you ask for some help?" And I thought that it made me look weak to ask for help. And no, I think it's actually stronger when you start to say, this is what my need is. Mm-hmm. When you feel empowered to use your voice to say what you need, then that's the beginning of your being able to use your voice and trust it to help somebody else and to start to make change. And that's how it happens. And, you know, the final thing I suppose I would say, and this came back to what, well, two things. One, for my birthday one year, President Obama gave me a present that was a copy of the original petition for universal suffrage, signed. And I'm like, how'd you get that? And he's like, presidents can do all kinds of things. I had visions of him sneaking into the Library of Congress one night. But anyway, I don't know how many signed copies there are, but I got one of them. And then side by side with that was the resolution when Congress gave women the right to vote, passed the 19th Amendment. And there's 50 years between the two. And I started thinking about all of the women who went on hunger strikes and protested and had their husbands yelling at them and were losing their jobs and were going to prison in order for women to have the right to vote. And many of the people who signed that petition weren't alive when it ultimately became the law of the land. But the point is that they took the baton and they went as far as they could go, and then they hand off the baton to the next person. And so when President Obama was in the Rose Garden, he gave the speech about marriage equality, he said, you know, if you're fortunate enough, you're here for these moments, it feels like a thunderbolt, or to use Martin Luther King's word, the arc of the moral universe just moves like a lightning towards justice. But if you think that, you have to also remember the decades that people worked to move that arc forward. Marriage equality was legal in 2 states when President Obama took office. When the marriage equality ruling came down from the Supreme Court, it was 37 states and the District of Columbia in 6 years, which shows you what can happen, but not if it hadn't been for the decades before. And so when it comes to gender equity, I just say, everybody in this room, you're part of the solution, and help us find our voices and empower us to use them to be forces for good. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you. Valerie Jarrett. Thank you.